second thing that I think is really important is that French theory is a product of US cultural imperialism. That foundation tends to be, at least within the intellectuals who are promoted globally, who emanate out of France, in opposition to actually existing socialism and a willingness or ability to accommodate capitalism and imperialism.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us a very special guest, Professor Gabriel Rockhill. Professor Rockhill is a Franco-American philosopher, cultural critic, and activist. He is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop and professor of philosophy at Villanova University. His books include Counter History of the Present, Untimely Interrogations into Globalization, Technology, Democracy. In addition to his scholarly work, he has been actively engaged in extra-academic activities in the art and activist world, as well as a regular contributor to public intellectual debate. Professor Rockhill, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
All right, so before we jump into more hardcore politics, give us a little bit of background, the kind of family you come from, who were you in school, leading up to perhaps college, and that would set up the sort of intellectual background for what we are going to discuss today, what you are calling as the culture theory industry.
Yeah, I grew up on a farm in rural Kansas in the center of the U.S. and ended up wanting to get off the farm. And so I went to college in the Midwest and then eventually studied abroad in Europe. I went to Belgium for a year and was kind of back and forth between the US and Europe because I was able to obtain some scholarships and things like that.
Which year it is? Give us the timeline, like 60s, 70s?
Oh, I'm not quite that old. I was born in the early 70s and I was going to school. I went to school in the early 1990s.
Okay.
And so that's when I went to college, and then I ended up going to do my graduate work because I was able to obtain a grant after my undergraduate. I believe it was around 95, 96. And I spent well over a decade in Paris where I did graduate work in philosophy, sociology, other fields. And then ended up getting a Ph.D. in philosophy at the University of Paris VIII under the direction of Alain Badiou. And then I also did a Ph.D. in the United States at Emory University and have been teaching at Villanova, I guess, since 2007. So moved back to the United States, but still do a number of things in Paris, notably a summer program through the Critical Theory Workshop that you mentioned in your introduction.
So the theory industry that we would be talking now was in many ways almost developed by the time you went to grad school.
Yeah, it was definitely emerging at, the theory industry, if you talk about it most generally, has been a product of the capitalist system and a kind of industrialized, centralized way of producing and distributing theory. And so the roots of the kind of theory industry in general go back quite far. But in my own scholarship, I've focused on the kind of role that the theory industry has played in the era of globalized capital and the kind of phase of accumulation that most people refer to as neoliberalism. So from about the 1970s to the present. And more specifically, the figures that I focus on did largely become predominant within the academy began in the 1980s for someone like Derrida. Michel Lamont, who's an interesting French sociologist, has done some kind of quantitative studies regarding the presence of deconstruction in Derrida within journals in the Anglophone world, kind of beginning in the 80s, and then it really skyrockets in the 90s. And so as you have actually existing socialism in the Soviet sphere being dismantled, you have simultaneously the kind of skyrocketing of a form of French theory, led by the group of figures referred to as post-structuralists. And so when I went to college in the early 1990s, I was immediately exposed to the work, in particular, of people like Derrida, Kristeva, Luce Irigaray, and others, who were considered to be the kind of vanguard of radical theory at that point in time. Zizek also immediately was kind of on the scene, at least within the intellectual circles that I was in the early 1990s. Laclau and Mouffe and Judith Butler would soon come into the mix as well. There was a kind of general euphoria around post-structuralist theory, and it was definitely predominant within the intellectual circles within which I operated at that point in time. And given that I grew up on a farm doing farm work, and I also worked construction for decades of my life, in my studies, I was always drawn to work that addressed the problems of real working people and hopefully had some use value for the struggle of the oppressed of the world. And so I was, I think, quite unfortunately, in looking back on it, but I probably share this a lot with other people as well, I thought that if this theory was really radical and cutting edge, then there must be some type of real political payoff to it. And that it must address some of these fundamental issues like exploitation, oppression, imperialism, and things like this. And needless to say, it took a little bit of time working through, learning all the necessary languages, doing the background reading, etc. But it became clear to me quite quickly that there was a lack of rigorous materialist analysis of some of the fundamental aspects of the contemporary world. And so, although I was drawn a bit like a moth to the flame to some of the post-structuralist French theory, and then of course this expanded out into German critical theory and other traditions as well, I quite quickly pivoted towards more materialist analyses, if they be Bourdieusian sociological critiques of philosophy, or various Marxist critiques, or historical critiques for that matter.
So let's step back a little bit and go to perhaps 60s, because 60s was, this is the decade where a lot was going on. And I mean, you know, in this discussion, you were starting from the 80s, but I mean, one would say that people like Foucault began to rise since the 60s. I mean, I have read his Madness and Civilization that came about somewhere in 1963, I guess. So there was a rise within, but also in the 60s, there was a lot going on. There was the new left. So Marxism wasn't defeated in that sense. I mean, there was a lot of rethinking within Marxism. France's decolonization was going on. Vietnam was still yet to come, and 1968 was this radical moment. A lot was going on in China, the Soviet Union, but yet there were people like Foucault who was sort of emerging out of that. I mean, it's a sort of zigzag. So take us through that story. What was going on? Because there was a lot of, I mean, we may not have a lot of clarity about that.
Yeah, within France, there was a real kind of spike in the visibility and prominence of certain intellectual figures who were non-Marxists, who positioned themselves quite firmly and squarely against the most well-known French intellectuals of the post-war period, who were Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and some other figures kind of in those circles, who were Marxist, fellow travelers. They were never card-carrying members of the Communist Party, but they were, somewhat supportive of different socialist projects. Of course, Sartre and Beauvoir famously went to Cuba. Their opinions kind of varied through time on
also went to China, did she? Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And so there was a clear sensibility in the wake of World War II among at least a large segment of the French intelligentsia that Marxism had proven itself right by history, because these were the people who had fought and won against the fascists. And the liberals and the conservatives and reactionaries, of course, had lined up and either aided and abetted or directly contributed to the fascist rise of power. So it makes sense within that context. And so the rise of figures, particularly like Michel Foucault and Jacques Lacan, both of whom published books in 1966 that were bestsellers in France, really needs to be understood in terms of a kind of intellectual counter-revolution that was pitted very explicitly, particularly in the case of Foucault, against Sartre and against Marxism. And so Foucault's 1966 book, which really catapulted him into the limelight, which was The Order of Things, was, amongst other things, an attack on Marxism and the Marxist tradition. And the series of interviews that he did in the wake of the publication of that book really reveal what his center of gravity was. It was known, and I would invite your viewers and listeners to read his biographies if they're not familiar with them. It was very well known that Foucault was a violent anti-communist. That's a quote from his most well-known French biographer, and that he was a kind of technocrat and an institutional operator and even supported Gaullism and kind of looked away from the entire colonial question, which raises very serious questions about his political center of gravity. And he attacked Sartre for being a so-called man of the 19th century because he defended Marxism and said that, you know, Marxism was the philosophy of the times, and claimed that in the 20th century, Marxism was like a fish out of water, meaning it was stillborn, right? And this is amidst 1966. This is you know, amidst ongoing anti-colonial revolutions around the world and the expansion of the actually existing socialist world. So it's a blanket condemnation, not only of the Soviet Union and of China, but also of Vietnam, of Korea, of Cuba, of all of the other places that one could add to that list. And he would later double down even more on these quite reactionary political positions, claiming that everything in socialism, everything, that's his word, is to be condemned. Right? There's nothing to be salvaged whatsoever. And so within that context of the 1960s, what you basically have is an anti-Marxist, anti-communist kind of intellectual counter-revolution that is driven by a group of opportunist intellectuals who want the spotlight and want to take the spotlight away from people like Sartre and Beauvoir, who I don't agree 100% with all of their political positions, but at least they were you know, engaged in some forms of materialist analysis and were somewhat supportive of certain socialist practices. And so in that regard, the bourgeois press and the bourgeois cultural apparatus, meaning the entire system of production, distribution, and consumption of ideas, these are the universities, the publishing houses, the newspapers and magazines, the conference circuit, they immediately jumped on these counter-revolutionary intellectuals as an enormous opportunity to promote anti-Marxist work and to use it for their purposes. And so there was a kind of confluence of interests, if you will. On the one hand, you have opportunist petty bourgeois intellectuals who want to become, you know, the next intellectual stars and take the spotlight away from Sartre and Beauvoir. And on the other hand, you have the bourgeois cultural apparatus, which is aggressively looking for opportunists of their ilk so that they can be used in order to leverage power away from the Marxist camp. And in many ways, that's precisely what happened. And we could factor into this, because it's a large part of my research, that there were also international operators who played a significant role insofar as the governmental agencies of the US national security state had a vested interest in trying to discredit Marxism and replace it by the compatible left, as they refer to it, or forms of vague progressive leftism that are fine with and accommodate capitalism and US-driven imperialism. And so in that regard, there's, you know, a quite famous now at this point in time, a 1985 a CIA paper, a research paper that deals with the defection of the French intelligentsia that highlights the very important contribution made by structuralism. In particular, they pinpoint Foucault and the Annales School of Historiography to the demolition of Marxism as a kind of recognizable and kind of cherished form of intellectual analysis and, of course, practical transformation. And so it's within that larger context, I think, that you have to see these figures. And in relationship to this, one other element that's very important is the way that they were marketed in the Anglophone world is that these were 68 thinkers, right? There's a vague affiliation between Foucault, Lacan, Derrida, Bourdieu, Kristeva, and other figures like this, and the uprisings of 68. And I have a long research paper that I've been working on actually for seems like 5 years now that will soon come out that details all of this. So if what I say is surprising, I can assure you that it's backed up by an ample amount of evidence. These thinkers were all opposed to the workers' movement. And this is the beating heart of the uprising of 68, the largest worker strike, according to some accounts, in the history of Europe at that point in time. And it did lead to some significant gains for the working class. Another element, though, in 68 was the student and youth uprising, which trafficked in various forms of anarchism and Trotskyism and a kind of anti-communist radical liberalism, or what Michel Foucault calls libertarian liberalism. So a liberalism that then focuses on kind of cultural issues of individual liberation and things like this, without necessarily raising larger questions around, an analysis of the social totality, political economy, and things like this. And so what's interesting is that these thinkers were also generally opposed to, skeptical of, and sometimes hostile to the student movement. In fact, Foucault himself sat on the governmental commission that signed, or that established the reform, the university reform, that was one of the principal sparks for the student movement. Meaning that in 1968, Foucault was clearly on one side of the barricades. He was on the state Gaullist side of the barricades. He did not speak out in solidarity with the movement, express himself. He went to one very large protest or rally that was organized, but did not take a public stance for the 68 movement. But in the wake of 68, what is very important is opportunists like Foucault knew which way the wind was blowing, and he reinvented himself as a temporary kind of Maoist of sorts. And for a few years, then trafficked in kind of Maoist, and these have to be understood as the kind of cultural Maoism that was very present in France. I'm not talking about Mao and what he was doing in China. I'm talking about a kind of petty bourgeois version of cultural Marxism that was very prevalent in France at the time and really saturated a lot of the student movement. And so he presented himself in the wake of 68. He kind of caught the wave of radicalism, but was interested, like the other so-called 68 thinkers, in the consumer model of radicalism, meaning being able to sell his discourse and his theory as radical in order to profit off of the recent social movement and position himself as somehow the vanguard, when in fact he was widely identified as being a counter-revolutionary intellectual from very early on. And that's the same with a lot of the other intellectuals. You have to go through case by case, but for the most part, they were anti-68 thinkers, or at a minimum, thinkers who were highly, highly skeptical of the 68 uprising, definitely the workers' uprising, but also even elements of the student uprising.
Wow, that there's a lot there. I'll pick up one thread out of that, and I'm staying with the 60s for now. I'm just trying to understand how a sort of seemingly broad traditions of intellectual, different schools. I mean, you mentioned Annales School, but I mean, Annales School is not the same as Foucault, and this whole body that deals with discourse and has nothing with materialism and analysis. I mean, Brodel's work is not Marxist, but it's not just dealing with discourse. And then there is someone like Althusser, who's for long been considered as one of the leading Marxist intellectual, and he's writing on Marx. He is having this discussion with people like E.P. Thompson. So there's a lot going on there. And now schools also continues, and there are independent thinkers, or you call them Marxists, Sartre and Beauvoir. So how do we then end up, let's say, in the 70s and the 80s, with a sort of narrowing down? How did Foucault and Derrida, deconstruction and all sort of became the front runners, as Marxism and even Annales to a great extent, and all of them receded to the background? Just if you can spell out that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say two things. One is that I do think it's really important that the way in which bourgeois historiography tends to approach the issue of intellectual production is always downstream from the material forces that drive intellectual production, meaning that there's a tendency to think in terms of intellectuals, their ideas, and different movements and schools, but not to mine down into the material and institutional forces that are driving the production of these intellectuals and their schools and what they're doing, as can be seen in the kind of nature of their theoretical practice. And so I agree fully. Of course, the Annales School and what people call structuralism or post-structuralism, you could look at other movements within France, that there are some significant differences, many major debates within them. Foucault is connected to the kind of third generation of the Annales school to a certain extent. And you'd have to kind of map all of that out in a delicate manner, as I've done in some of my research. But what is really important is to be able to mine down into the material forces that are driving these different movements in various ways, and often will support movements that appear intellectually to be doing slightly different things in order to foster a framework of debate in which there's a basic and fundamental foundation that is respected. And that foundation tends to be, at least within the intellectuals who are promoted globally, who emanate out of France, in opposition to actually existing socialism, and a willingness or ability to accommodate capitalism and imperialism. And in that regard, there's a remarkable amount of consistency on the part of those French intellectuals who became the most famous once French theory was kind of internationalized. And so the second thing that I think is really important is that French theory is a product of US cultural imperialism. These figures did rise to prominence within France, as we were just talking about, but what really catapulted them internationally was the interest on the part of the US, and in particular, the capitalist ruling class and their foundations on the one hand, and the US state and their propaganda agencies on the other. I'll just point to one really key example in this regard, and that is that in 1966, there was a very famous conference that was organized at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And that brought together for the first time some of the leading luminaries of French theory, right? Lacan and Derrida met for the first time at that conference. Deleuze was invited, couldn't make it, sent in a paper. Roland Barthes was there, Todorov was there, René Girard was there, Paul de Man was there from Belgium. So it was a moment that catapulted French theory, and in particular structuralism, or it was kind of referred to as structuralism at that point in time, into the limelight. Where did this conference come from? Well, it was funded to the tune of $36,000, which is the equivalent of $250,000 today, by the Ford Foundation. And the Ford Foundation has a long and deep history of working on cultural imperialist projects of precisely this nature. The Ford Foundation had worked hand in glove with the Central Intelligence Agency in one of its major propaganda projects, which was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, an organization that had offices in 35 countries, ran prestige magazines around the world, had hired between hundreds of full-time propagandists that were working for them. This was funded by the CIA and by the Ford Foundation. And when it was they had their cover blown, which happened to be the same year in 1966, the Ford Foundation tried to run cover for the Central Intelligence Agency by taking over the funding of the Congress for Cultural Freedom in its entirety, right? So the Ford Foundation, we have to understand, is simply an extension of the Ford Corporation and of the capitalist ruling class. And the fact that they would fund and support this type of a conference, and it wasn't only the conference that brought together all these luminaries, it was also a series of follow-up seminars, international exchanges, and then also Hopkins began inviting regular visiting professors to Hopkins and became the first kind of center for French theory within the United States. All of that was done within this kind of larger oversight by the corporatocracy. The Ford Foundation had their representative, Sigmund Koch, who attended the conference, and the Carnegie Foundation also had Peter Cause, who attended the conference. And so, and the conference itself also had coverage by Time, Newsweek, Le Monde, the Partisan Review. All of these outlets have very well-established and deep ties to the Central Intelligence Agency and to propaganda platforms within the US national security state. So in that regard, we can see that French theory is, this is just one example, and I could point to many more. It has to be understood as a product of US-driven cultural imperialism. And the people who were invited to the Hopkins conference didn't happen to include the gentleman that you mentioned a moment ago, Louis Althusser. If you're organizing an international conference on structuralism in 1966, a moment at which Althusser was globally one of the most famous structuralists, and he'd just done a series of important publications with a group of students who would emerge as the kind of Althusserian crowd, You would think that he would be on the list, but he was a member of the Communist Party and was therefore a persona non grata in the United States. And it was very clear that the agenda was to promote within the United States the version of French theory that was non-Marxist and more explicitly anti-Marxist. And of course, this would lead then to later collaborations and international promotion of the anti-Marxist French theorists by the work being done. Paul de Man would then later go on to Yale and invite Derrida regularly to Yale. And there were these other hubs within the United States that were set up in order to continue promoting this type of anti-Marxist theory, at the expense, of course, of all of the other important intellectual work that's going on in France at that point in time. So everybody, or most people in the Anglophone world, would be aware of who Jean-Paul Sartre is. Most people don't know who Michel Cluscar is, or who Georges Gastaut is, or Annie Lacouaris, or many other figures, Émeric Monville, who I could point to and say, well, these are important French theorists who don't happen to abide by the fundamental foundational principle for promotion on the part of US cultural imperialism, and that is anti-communism combined with accommodation to capitalism and to imperialism.
So this was like the sort of this theory industry was rooted in actual industry, like industry of capitalism, where this was sort of the what some would call the hegemonic element of global capitalism that was competing at that time with the Soviet Union, but also things that were going on in China.
Exactly.
This is sort of a very, I would like a very quick response in this. It is often said that I don't remember whether it was the 10th Congress after Stalin, some of the archives that came out about the Soviet Union, the gulags. Some of the French theorists actually found China and Maoism as their sort of alternative to the Soviet Union, and they stayed with that, flirted, but then eventually sort of went in their own direction. Is this a sort of right understanding of what was going on at that time?
There was a segment of the French intelligentsia that followed precisely that pattern, which in and of itself, I think, is misdirected, because the idea that there would be some perfect model out there in the world, instead of socialist projects that emerge in fits and starts with enormous difficulties, with setbacks, with imperialist incursions, etc., should be much more realistic and much more dialectical when you look for examples in the world than some of these French theorists were. And so there was a famous trip that I know Kristeva was on it, and I believe Philippe Solers and Roland Barthes were as well, but don't quote me on that because I'm not certain. I'd have to check my notes on it, when they went to China in the 60s in order to see whether or not their presuppositions about China being a better model than the Soviet Union could be confirmed. But that quickly dissipated. And so many of them moved from kind of flirting with actually existing socialism to being, questioning it and then being openly hostile to it. And most of them, actually, you can chart out their career arc. The more critical they were of actually existing socialism, the more famous they tended to become within the global theory industry and within the cultural imperialist projects of the US. Of course, there should be nothing surprising about that.
Tell us a little bit about the relationship. I mean, you have said a little bit already, but I wanted to place this in the context, because France, the decolonization movement was going on, and in Vietnam it was extending up to the 1970s. I mean, of course, the Americans took over the French, but who were some of these intellectuals who sort of, who are some of them who never spoke against the anti-imperialist movements that were going on in the colonies? And if you'd like to also tell us who were the French intellectuals who actually fought for decolonization in the colonies, 60s, 70s.
Yeah, in general, when you look at the major French theorists who are known internationally, the majority of them either turned a blind eye to the colonial question, or they kind of disingenuously presented themselves after the fact as somehow being supportive in various ways. Like Foucault literally lies about his own biography if you track out the interviews, which I have done, in order to present himself as somehow like on the side of the oppressed when he obviously wasn't. And
you wrote Foucault went abroad. Where did he go?
He was in a few different places. He was in Sweden, he was in Poland, and then he was in Tunisia.
Okay.
And it is true that when he was in Tunisia, there was a significant student uprising. And he provided some mild support to that student uprising, apparently hid a typewriter in his garden for some of the student activists, is on record as saying that he was impressed by some of the Marxism of the students, and later pointed back to, I believe this was in 66, 67, pointed back to it as a moment that began to radicalize him. And then after 68 happened in France, that kind of pushed him further. There's a little bit of, anyway, there's more that could be said about that, but the position that people like Sartre and Beauvoir, and in general the Marxist intelligentsia, people like Michel Simon or Michel Kluska or some of the other figures that I mentioned before, being a Marxist meant being an anti-imperialist, right? And so being on the side of the globally oppressed and lining up against the imperialist war machine in whatever manifestation it might take. And so there's a clear demarcation between I wouldn't say all of the Marxists, I would say those, Marxists who are also anti-imperialists and who are internationalists, importantly, because there were others who were, Marxism comes in many different forms. And so there were those who could be kind of social democratic Marxists who would abide by or accept certain forms of imperialism, certain Trotskyists. But the French intelligentsia of, people like Bourdieu or Derrida or Lacan or others, these were people who, might very well and did in certain cases tell stories about growing up or living in colonies or neo-colonies and turn these kind of stories into autofiction or reflection on being decentered as a subject and things like this. But we're not resolute supporters of anti-colonial movements and of people like Fanon, of course, because there's the famous connections between Sartre and Beauvoir on the one hand and Frantz Fanon, and his militant support of Algerian independence. And so there's a clear kind of demarcation, I think, between the anti-imperialists and those who, some of them, are basically amount to being pro-imperialist, but for the most part, they tended to just either turn a blind eye or be accommodating to imperialism, and instead focus on other things like Heidegger's ontology or the history of Western metaphysics or what they perceived as the kind of, various developments in the history of European civilization. Foucault, of course, later famously wrote on the Iranian Revolution and took some rather problematic positions in that regard, but was never pointed out in any of his writings on Iran that there had been a CIA orchestrated coup d'etat. And so clearly didn't have a very robust understanding of geopolitics and of imperialism, and did not.
He wrote about the 79 revolution.
Yeah, exactly. But he wrote extensively.
But not about the 53.
Exactly, the overthrow of Mossadegh and the installation of the Shah. But he wrote extensively on Iran, its recent history, and just, I guess, happened to miss a really fundamental point, and that is that the Shah was a CIA puppet government. And so there's also just, there's a lot of social chauvinism in the French intelligentsia, meaning a kind of cultural arrogance and the assumption that they can just focus on all things French and French history and Western European history and just ignore the colonies. And it saturates a lot of their work, unfortunately.
Absolutely. I think this is something which has a much longer history in France, the kind of chauvinism. One of the things I read, I don't remember exactly if it was Hobsbawm, but someone said that one of the problems of fighting the Napoleonic empire was that it came with this whole sort of flag of modernity and progress and so on. So any princely states, the German states or Spain or Russia, if they would resist, they would be called as the sort of old regime. So they came with the flag of new regime, and it becomes difficult to resist anti-imperial. And this is something which is still going on. I mean, what's going on with the Muslims in France? I mean, it's appalling, and that is often justified in the name of, progress and separation of state and religion and so on.
Absolutely.
This is very, very deeply rooted in French culture. This is not even something which is very peculiar to these.
Well, it's an imperialist culture, right? And so racism and social chauvinism really deeply saturated. And of course, that is amplified by the bourgeois cultural apparatus within France. And so racism is just completely normalized, and particularly racism, of course, that targets the subjects of imperialism. And that's incredibly palpable for anyone who knows French culture or has spent time there.
Well, we've come to the US and the more recent turn of the century, but if you could just tell us a little bit about what was going on at the ground in France in the 70s, because I mean, France had a longer history with socialist experiments, I mean, at least up until the middle of the 90s. And and the Communist Party came out very strong of the Second World War because of their resistance to the Nazis. So, and I don't know if I'm exactly right on this, but beginning with the 70s, the communists started to sort of lose out to the socialists, but the socialists did try a lot of experiment, and they failed, of course, because on the other side of the Atlantic, Reagan and Thatcher had already, Thatcher on this side, they had already come, and it was very difficult, and Soviet Union itself was becoming very, very weak. But give us a background about what was going on at the level of the politics, and if at all they engaged. I mean, you've already mentioned a lot about the 60s, but in general, did they engage with the French radical politics at that point in time?
Did they, meaning the
intellectuals that we are discussing? But right. Give us a background about what was going on in larger governance, in the realm of governance and popular politics.
Yeah, it's true that in the wake of World War II, the Communist Party was the leader of the internal resistance against the fascist occupation. And so, needless to say, they emerged in the wake of World War II as being one of the leading forces. And it was looking like they might be able to gain power, even through the ballot box. And when you look at the kind of evolution from the post-World War II era to the 1970s, of course, there's a lot that goes on, right? There's, in the international sphere, you move from the Stalin era to Khrushchev, and there's a whole series of kind of criticisms that come out regarding the Stalin era actually existing socialism, that obviously
the revisionist criticism of Stalin.
Exactly. And that, of course, had a big impact on certain segments of the intelligentsia. You had the fact that the intelligentsia as well was being driven by this kind of cultural imperialism. So the people who were becoming the most famous and being invited to the United States and to all of these junkets and showered with praise and money, these were the people who were anti-Marxists. But actually, I should probably deal with the first half of the question first, because it's about the history of the political organizing. One of the complications with the relationship between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, and this is it's not just in France, right? It's also, you see similar patterns within the imperial core. You see it within the United States, and you see it within Western Europe in general. And that is that the CP moved in the direction of becoming much less of a revolutionary socialist platform or party, and much more of a kind of social democratic reformist party. And there's a few really key dates. In 1976, the Communist Party of France abandoned the reference to the dictatorship of the proletariat, which dictatorship might be a scary word to some people, but it basically means that the state, right, of course, but the state would be in the hand of the workers, not in the hand of the capitalist class, is what it means. In 1979, the Communist Party actually removed all references in their statutes to Marxism-Leninism and to proletarian internationalism. And by the 1990s, they just abandoned democratic centralism, right? So like many of the other communist parties in the imperial core, there's a kind of evolution in the direction of reformism and a kind of capitalist accommodation at the end of the day, which led to very complicated situations at the level of organizing. Many of the intellectuals who were revolutionary intellectuals and dedicated to socialist transformation, supported, critically granted, but supported actually existing socialism. Many of them worked through the CP and tried to push it in a direction that was more revolutionary and less reformist. And that ended up, I think, ultimately, it kept the CP on course to a certain extent, but ultimately a lot of them later, it could be in the 80s or the 90s, ended up leaving the CP, splitting off and founding other organizations and eventually other parties. The life story of Georges Gastaut is quite interesting in that regard. I believe he's about 70 years old now, but he was a major intellectual within the CP for years, broke with the CP, and now is one of the leading intellectuals of the PRCF. So in that regard, there's a kind of the overall evolution of the Communist Party. And then also they had delegates within two of the socialist governments, but the Socialist Party, of course, in France, not unlike other kind of socialist parties that you'd see, if it be like the Labour Party in the US or in the UK or experiments here in the US, these were parties that really did accommodate capitalism in quite significant ways. And the Socialist Party of the 1970s had a lot more teeth than the Socialist Party of today within France, but it was still very, very compromised. And so all of that led to a kind of highly problematic evolution that, of course, then also had an enormous impact on the intelligentsia. So a lot of the intelligentsia in the post-war era, they were either party members or fellow travelers. A lot of the figures that we're talking about are free agent intellectuals who are usually, in fact, almost systematically anti-party and anti-state, meaning they're against actually existing socialist states and they're against the party form. And party organizing in general. And so in that regard, there's quite a significant transformation in that regard. If they are involved or were involved in forms of organizing like Foucault or Derrida, Derrida was involved in very explicit anti-communist organizing and did illegal activities in Czechoslovakia and was arrested there. He was the co-founder of the Jan Hus Foundation, which received funding from the Margaret Thatcher Foundation, from US governmental agencies in order to basically do anti-communist subversion. So he did engage in activism, which was anti-communist activism, quite not only explicitly, but quite practically. And it's probably his most significant practical engagement. In the case of Foucault, particularly in the wake of the 1968 uprisings, he was involved in various Maoist organizations, some prison organizing and things like that, very explicitly anti-Marxist. And he had said as much in that regard. And so there was more of a kind of, anarchist or liberal orientation that meant that you could your politics would amount to going and voting for one of the capitalist candidates once every 4 or 5 years, or you'd get involved in some type of community or an anarchist-driven kind of model of organizing or set of organizations, like in the case of Foucault or Deleuze kind of did that as well. So yeah, that's a kind of, at least quick, we're talking about a lot of different years, so there's a lot going on there, but at least a quick overview of some of the important elements.
Right. Yeah, this is very helpful. I mean, some of this complicated relationship with the Communist parties becoming sort of social democratic party was also it played out very strikingly in India. One sections of the Communist Party going direction of what is called as the Naxalites. I mean, it's a complex story, but then, these sort of internal tensions between the Communist parties, and then there were socialists and so on. Exactly. You wanted to say something?
No, I was just agreeing that it's an international problem. Yeah. The history of the relationship between the social democratic version of socialism and a more revolutionary version of socialism. But of course, there are lots of nuances and other shades of gray that one could add in. But there are complex histories that continue to write themselves, right? Because there are ongoing issues today as well.
And the fall of the Soviet Union in many ways sort of sealed this sort of, they were still struggling, but they were still there. I mean, particularly noticeable is the decline of the French Communist Party and the Italian Communist Party. And one of my friends recently went to France, and he said that he went to the French Communist Party office, and he said that it is visible how grand they were. I mean, you don't even have to look at the numbers. They're one sort of majestic French and Italian. And I guess that has a huge sort of setback in terms of popular politics in Europe, kind of politics into which it has degenerated, the defeat of the Italian and the French Communist parties.
100%. I mean, one of the most difficult things about organizing in the imperial core is precisely the legacy of certain party projects that were very powerful, that brought in a lot of people, educated a lot of people, had a lot of potential, did do some very good things along the way, but that has left us in a situation in which we're in, and we have been for a while now, in a phase of reconstruction. And that phase of reconstruction is extraordinarily difficult, given the consequences of these movements and these parties and the need to rebuild them. And it's also in a very different context, and we have very limited time. Right. Because of the increasing threats of World War III and nuclear annihilation, ecological degradation that is at an unprecedented pace. And so we're faced with, well, like humanity in general, doing something that seems, very difficult, to say the least. But it is one of the most important things, is to, if we want to save humanity, the planet, and reduce oppression and exploitation and imperialism, then we need to have powerful organizations that can do that. And right now, we're still in a process in many countries around the world of building. And so hopefully your viewers and listeners are already plugged into some of those important projects. Otherwise, I would encourage them to do so, because it's one of the most important things in our era.
Absolutely. I think the decline of political organizations is the one single largest defeat and victory of capitalism that we see today. And I mean, even some of the radical political options that emerged, the moment they extinguish, the reason they extinguish so quickly, tend to extinguish. I mean, I'm not saying that the underlying organizations extinguish, that this over-reliance or cultic figure, that leads to, so the options are between Jeremy Corbyn or, Keir Starmer or Bernie Sanders or the establishment Democrats or in France, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, but less focus has been on actual organizations, building organizations, and some of the green parties and all are like, they do have, in my view, elements of popular politics, but they also tend to be co-opted into the sort of corporation-like structure.
Yeah, and if I could just say really quickly, one of the pernicious consequences of a lot of the theorists that we've been talking about, and this also goes not just for the French theorists that we were talking about, but also a lot of German-style critical theory coming out of the Frankfurt School, and for that matter, the other kind of leading luminaries of European theory, people like Zizek, people like Agamben, Laclau, right? Even though Laclau's from Latin America, he's kind of within that camp, Judith Butler and others like this, is that there is, with a few exceptions, there is a resounding hostility to party organizing. Absolutely. As if somehow parties in and of themselves just reproduce hierarchies and domination. And so there is a knee-jerk, very uninformed, very uneducated, very unhistorical, anarchist-driven rejection of people getting organized in such a way that they could fight and win, right?
And that also,
it's fine.
That also merges with hostility towards the state itself. I mean, the welfare state, everything is Stalinism. Stalinism becomes this boogeyman. So the reaction towards party and reaction towards the developmental state go hand in hand. And then all we are left with is different NGOs and different voluntary organizations. I mean, it's a joke to think of voluntary organizations to take on massive corporations. I mean, I'm not saying we don't need that, but I mean,
yeah, and many of them are just cutouts anyway of major corporations, security states, and other such things. I mean, the NGOification, there's been many very, very good critiques of NGOs, even though, of course, in certain instances, they can do certain things that are good, et cetera, et cetera. But I couldn't agree more that the anti-party, anti-state ideology, which is the dominant ideology within the purported left intelligentsia, is an enormous bulwark against the type of work that actually has to be done. Because if we want to move away from capitalism and from environmental degradation, imperialism, et cetera, then we need to get organized in order to do it. And we actually have to leverage land and regions away from imperialism. And so the problem with a lot of the kind of anarchist-driven style that at best it's anarchist, because at times it's just liberal or conservative or reactionary, but that kind of overall orientation is that it leaves the people bereft of the fundamental tools that are necessary for struggling for liberation and actually winning. And so, of course, it has to be situated within a larger project of cultural imperialism, in which the leading intellectual luminaries in the capitalist world would be those who broadcast to the masses a message that the most important tools that have been historically proven to work, by which people can organize, fight, and win, should be off the table entirely for some type of insipid moral judgment that they're bad because there might be leadership, or they might be organized, or there might be discipline, or all of these other horrors. And so there's also a very deeply baked in kind of libertarian ideology of the freedom of the individual to just think and do whatever they want. And we go kind of whistling down the lane of La La Land while people aren't getting organized. And so I really think that we need to overcome that. And fortunately, at least within the circles that I operate in, people are overcoming that, particularly young people who are sick and tired of hearing a whole series of lies about things that they can't do or shouldn't do, or that are bad, even though the people who usually accuse them of being bad haven't even been in parties, so they didn't even know. So anyway, I could say more about that, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, it just, you're shifting from here, just a word on anarchism itself. I mean, it does have a long history, and you are talking about a particular strand of more sort of post-democratic tendency. I mean, the revolutionaries of Paris Commune were mostly, at least they called themselves anarchists, and in Marx writing, he spends time that, they call themselves anarchists, but they are mostly Marxists, writing about that sort of historic document about the Paris Commune. And then we had the whole Spanish Civil War, the American anarchists who operated more like Marxists, but so then the syndicalists were there. So just to sort of
I agree 100%. No, I'm referring to more the kind of dominant anti-party, anti-state logic of a certain segment of
university kind of anarchist.
What's that?
University kind of anarchist.
Yeah, the kind of libertarian version.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Which is different than the IWW and different, right, than a lot of other examples that we could point to, for sure.
Right. Yeah. I have two questions, so just manage your time. One on fascism and its, how do you, since you have written on that, so very quickly I wanted to, comment, hear your comments on the far right and fascism. And also I wanted to hear you on how you look at the whole identity politics, and if you have any sort of take on that, or the sort of this, whatever we are discussing in the intellectual domain. So why not take up both of them together, or as you like. Tell us how you are looking at the identity politics, because it becomes somewhat of complicated, because there is the identity politics of the far right, and then there is the liberal establishment's identity politics, and they kind of feed each other in justifying each other. And there are issues within issues on gender, sexualities, which are really important. Sometimes the attack on identity politics degenerates into very sexism and kind of, all that stuff. So just tell us how are you looking at this current state of order, to use the most redundant.
Well, I think identity politics is an ideology that emerges in the neoliberal phase of capitalist accumulation, in which you have in the imperial center many of those, or not many, a certain class segment from the kind of comprador bourgeoisie of the periphery that moves up in its class standing. So you have a more diverse kind of petty bourgeoisie or middle strata within the imperial core, and that identity politics historically has functioned in such a way that class can be more or less erased or just made into a question of identity. And it's replaced then by these, identities that can be used within the imperial core as a central focal point for what's referred to as politics. But it really amounts to, and Adolf Reed Jr.'s work on this is excellent, it's a class politics, so that the diverse petty bourgeoisie can leverage their identity categories in order to get promotions, more jobs, open up jobs for their people, be the spokesman for their people or spokespeople for their people, and other such things. So I do think that identity politics, if it be liberal or conservative, is largely a product of the kind of neoliberal phase of capitalism, and that it should not be surprising that there would be a kind of essentialist white and right-wing version of identity politics, because they basically traffic in the exact same logic, right? The content might be different, meaning it's like white bros as opposed to people of color or trans people or things like this, but the basic fundamental form is the same, that we are a minority and that we need representation, we need greater visibility, etc. The final political consequences, of course, can be different, right? In the case of more fascist or authoritarian versions of right-wing identity politics. But the other thing that is really important to understand about identity politics is that it has also been a historical project of casting the longest shadow possible over actually existing history. And the history of racialized groups, the history of women, the history of sexually oppressed minorities has been the history in which Marxists have been at the vanguard of the struggle against both oppression and what many Marxists call super exploitation. So not just exploitation of a wage worker, but exploitation of like proletarians from the global south or from immigrant labor or from prison labor or other things like this. And so if you look back and you actually know the history of actually existing socialism, you would know that Valentin Mogadam, who as far as I know is not a Marxist or even a defender of the Soviet Union, has written very poignantly on the fact that the Bolshevik Revolution instituted the most significant emancipation of women in the history of the world. That's an amazing, amazing accomplishment. And most of the identity politics feminists that I know are not pointing to the Bolsheviks as the vanguard leaders of feminist emancipation. Granted, we could talk about what later happened under Stalin, certain setbacks, why that happened, and kind of contextualize that more broadly. And we have to always be nuanced about this. But the same is absolutely true for racial questions. Who was the global leader in the fight against national oppression? It was Lenin, who declared repeatedly that the fundamental principle was the self-determination of nations. And what are nations? They are groups that share a common culture and language and history, and often ethnic and racial traits. And so in that regard, the founding of the Soviet Union was a founding of a multinational and multi-ethnic state, in which all of the states had the right to decide whether or not they would adhere to the Soviet Union. It's not by chance that in a case in the United States in the interwar period, who were the leading anti-segregationists? What was the Communist Party? Of course, right? Years and years, decades before all of the liberal identitarians said, oh, this is this new thing that now we're thinking about. We're thinking about racial oppression. We're thinking about the oppression of women and the oppression of sexuality. It's just based on a combination of historical myopia and historical ignorance. And so identity politics is also a counter-revolutionary politics against the actual politics of the oppression of these groups, which needs to constantly be understood as both oppression and exploitation, right? Because it has to be rooted within the ways in which the oppression of women historically has been linked to their exploitation as laborers within the domestic sphere, just as the oppression of racialized groups has been linked to their super exploitation as imperial subjects, right?
Right. In the 1920s and 1930s, when NAACP was, turned its back against working class, black working class, or at best they were doing legal cases. It was the communists who were working, and this was the time of the New Deal when the civil rights section was at best under pressure from the black activism, were taking up some cases. But you go to Alabama and look at how the radical working class was organized, black work, and it was very difficult because this was not the organization in the industrial north. It was mainly communist leaders working with radical black working class union organizers in the 1930s and 1940s.
Hammer and hoe, right?
Hammer and hoe, right?
Yeah, exactly, which gives a really interesting and detailed history of black communist organizing in the South.
Right, yeah. And then from 1953, we end up in Brown, and it sort of becomes a more formal kind of, and then there was a spike in the 1960s. But anyway, this has been an exciting 1 hour. I appreciate, there was so much to discuss, and I'm sure we'd have you again. But thank you so much for your time, and I hope this is just the beginning of a long association.